A cold winter evening was crawling across the city, the streets wrapped in a silence that carried hidden cries of those forgotten by the world. Among these shadows walked a girl, no more than 16, her clothes worn and frayed, her eyes dimmed by hunger, but still carrying a flicker of stubborn light. She had no family left to call her own, no bed to lie in, and no name that anyone cared to remember. Yet life hadn't stripped her of the ability to love. She carried in her heart an invisible dream, fragile but alive, of being seen, of being needed. As she wandered under the dim street lamps, she stumbled upon a dark figure curled against a broken wooden crate. It wasn't a person, it was a dog. A German shepherd, strong yet weak, its ribs showing, its eyes cautious but pleading, as if it too knew the taste of abandonment. The girl froze, unsure at first if she should step closer. The dog lifted its head, ears twitching, eyes alert. There was a moment of silent recognition between the two, an unspoken bond of shared pain. She whispered softly, afraid the sound of her voice might scare it away. But to her surprise, the dog didn't move. Instead, it let out a low whimper, a sound of surrender rather than threat. Carefully, she knelt down beside it, her breath visible in the cold air. She stretched out her hand slowly, and after a pause, the German shepherd pressed its nose gently against her palm. That touch, so simple, was like a spark that lit a fire inside her heart. She wasn't alone anymore. The girl named him Shadow, because he followed her as if he were a part of her soul. From that night onward, wherever she went, Shadow went too. Together they scavenged for food, sometimes sharing scraps from garbage bins, sometimes relying on the kindness of strangers who felt pity for the sight of a starving girl and her dog. But even in hunger, even in exhaustion, there was warmth. The Shadow would curl around her at night, keeping her body from freezing, while she whispered promises to him that one day their life would change. She had nothing to give him except love, yet Shadow acted as though that love was the greatest treasure he had ever known. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the two became inseparable. Shadow's once dull eyes began to glow with loyalty and life, and the girl, too, found new strength in his presence. When people looked at her before, they saw nothing more than a homeless child, invisible and unworthy. But with Shadow by her side, people noticed her differently. Some with suspicion, but many with quiet admiration. The way Shadow stayed glued to her side, protective yet gentle, made them look like a family. And in truth, they were. Shadow wasn't just her dog. He was her protector, her comforter, her hope. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't completely forgotten her. One evening, as the two rested near a closed bakery, the scent of warm bread wafting through the cracks of the door, the girl closed her eyes and imagined what life could be like if she had a home. 4 walls, a roof, a warm bed, and Shadow stretched out beside her on the floor, safe and loved. She didn't dare dream too deeply, afraid the dream would shatter, but Shadow seemed to sense her thoughts. He placed his head on her lap, as if promising that no matter what, he would never leave. It was in that moment that she realized something profound. She had saved him, yes, but he had saved her too. One night, fate came knocking in an unexpected way. The girl heard shouting from across the street. A man was trying to snatch an old woman's handbag. Before she could react, Shadow leapt up, a growl rumbling from deep within his chest, and dashed toward the attacker. The thief, startled by the sudden fury of the German shepherd, dropped the bag and ran into the darkness. The old woman, trembling, clutched her belongings and turned her gaze toward the girl and her dog. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "You saved me." The girl shook her head and said softly, "He saved us both." That night, something shifted in her destiny. The old woman couldn't get the image out of her mind, the homeless girl with the loyal German shepherd who risked his safety for her. The next morning she returned with a basket of food, calling out until the girl appeared. Shadow barked once, but his tail wagged, recognizing kindness. The woman offered them bread, cheese, and a warm blanket. It was the first time in months the girl had tasted food that didn't come from scraps. The kindness brought tears to her eyes, but more than that, it reminded her that humanity still existed. Shadow wagged his tail furiously, as if he too understood the significance of this gift. Days followed, and the woman kept returning, each time with food, sometimes with warm clothes, sometimes just with conversation. Slowly, she pieced together the girl's story, how she had lost her parents to tragedy, how she had no relatives to take her in, how she had been surviving on her own since. The old woman's heart ached. But what moved her most was not the girl's suffering, it was the way she spoke about Shadow. She didn't describe him as a pet, but as her family, her reason to keep fighting, her light in the darkness. The woman realized she couldn't let them both suffer any longer. One crisp morning she came with a different offer, not just food, but a home. At first the girl was stunned, unable to believe what she had heard. She clutched Shadow tightly, afraid it was a dream that would vanish if she moved. "But him too?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old woman smiled warmly and nodded. "Both of you, you belong together." That moment broke the dam of fear and loneliness inside her. Tears poured down her cheeks as Shadow barked joyfully, circling them in excitement. After so long of being unwanted, they finally had someone who wanted them both. The transition to a real home was overwhelming. The girl couldn't sleep the first night, afraid she'd wake up back on the cold street. Shadow, sensing her unease, lay close, his steady breathing, reminding her that this was real. Slowly, she adjusted. Warm meals, soft clothes, and laughter filled the days, and with each passing moment, her soul began to heal. Shadow thrived too, his coat growing glossy, his strength returning, his spirit unbreakable. They no longer looked like two broken beings clinging to survival. They looked like a family. And that bond, forged in the hardest nights of their lives, was unshakable. It was a story that spread quietly but powerfully. A homeless girl and a German shepherd who saved each other, and in doing so, reminded everyone around them what love, loyalty, and compassion truly mean. They were living proof that even in the darkest of circumstances, hearts can still find their way to warmth. For the girl, Shadow wasn't just her dog. He was her miracle. And for Shadow, the girl wasn't just his rescuer. She was his world. Together, they showed that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones you create, not the ones you're born into. The girl's new life began like the slow unfolding of a flower that had been buried under ice for too long. Each day revealed something she had forgotten existed. Warmth, kindness, and the sense of being safe. She would wake up to the smell of breakfast, not the harsh chill of the streets. Shadow, always alert, would sit by her side, wagging his tail as if to remind her that this miracle was as real for him as it was for her. But deep inside, a small voice still whispered fear. What if it all disappears again? That fear kept her clinging tighter to Shadow, for he was the one constant she believed she could never lose. The old woman who had taken them in, kind yet strong, treated them not as charity cases, but as family. She taught the girl how to cook simple meals, how to mend clothes, and even encouraged her to start reading again. Books became the girl's escape and her hope, showing her that her story wasn't over yet. Sometimes she would read aloud, and Shadow would rest his head on her lap, listening as though the words were written for him too. In those quiet evenings, she realized that she no longer felt invisible. She was seen, not just by Shadow, but by someone who cared enough to believe in her. One afternoon, the old woman suggested they visit a park. The girl hesitated, worried that people might look at her the way they used to, as if she were nothing but a stray child. But with Shadow trotting proudly beside her, she gathered the courage to go. To her surprise, the stares she received were different this time. Children rushed to pet Shadow, laughing at his playful barks, while their parents smiled at the sight of the loyal dog and his young owner. For the first time, the girl didn't feel like an outcast. She felt like part of the world. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten how to cherish. As weeks turned into months, Shadow began to reveal more of his true nature. He wasn't just protective. He was intelligent, almost uncanny, in how he sensed danger. One evening when smoke began to rise from a neighboring house, it was Shadow who barked wildly, drawing attention before the flames could spread. His actions saved a family, and once again the community saw the pair as heroes. The girl watched proudly as her once starving companion stood tall, admired by everyone around him. She whispered into his ear, "You were always a hero, even when no one saw it." Shadow licked her cheek, as though agreeing, but not all challenges disappeared. The girl often struggled with memories of the past. Cold nights under bridges, the sound of hunger gnawing at her stomach, the faces of people who walked past her as if she didn't exist. Sometimes she would wake up trembling, afraid it was all a dream. In those moments, Shadow became her anchor, pressing close, his heartbeat steady against hers. He reminded her that they had endured the worst together, and they could face anything ahead. Slowly, she began to believe not only in Shadow's strength, but in her own. The old woman saw something special in the girl and decided to enroll her in school. At first, the girl was terrified. How could she walk into a classroom when she had lived on the streets? But with encouragement, she went, carrying Shadow's memory of loyalty inside her as strength. She struggled at first, her hands rough from hardship, her knowledge behind others, but her determination set her apart. And whenever she returned home, Shadow greeted her with the same unconditional joy, reminding her that no matter what happened in the world outside, she would always be loved at home. Over time, the girl began to shine. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was growing. Her laughter returned, light and pure, filling the once quiet home with warmth. She would tell Shadow about her day as if he understood every word, and in his way he did. The bond between them became legendary in their neighborhood. People often said they were more than just girl and dog. They were soulmates, two broken beings who had stitched each other back together. And in truth, each scar they carried told a story of survival that had led them to one another. One summer, the girl's life took another turn when she earned a scholarship to study veterinary medicine. It was a dream born directly from Shadow's love. And though she was nervous about stepping into the wider world, she knew she carried his loyalty within her heart. On the day she left for her first class, Shadow barked proudly at the door, his tail wagging as if he understood the significance. The old woman, watching from the porch, wiped tears from her eyes. It was more than education. It was proof that hope could grow in even the harshest soil. At the university, the girl often felt the weight of her past pressing against her. Surrounded by students who came from comfort and privilege, she sometimes wondered if she truly belonged. But each time doubt whispered in her ear, she remembered Shadow waiting at home, believing in her without question. That memory gave her the strength to keep moving forward. Soon, her professors noticed her determination, and her classmates began to admire her resilience. She didn't flaunt her story, but those who knew it were moved to their core. Meanwhile, Shadow became somewhat of a local hero. The old woman often took him to community events, where children ran to pet him and parents shared the story of how he had once saved lives. He stood tall and proud, not knowing the legend he had become, only knowing that his world began and ended with the girl he had once met on a cold street corner. To him, she was not just his human. She was his destiny. Their bond was a living reminder that sometimes the most important family members walk on four legs instead of two. But time, as it always does, brought with it inevitable change. One autumn evening, the girl returned home from her studies to find Shadow slower than usual, his steps heavy, his eyes tired. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur, and whispered, "It's okay, my boy. You've given me everything." Her heart broke knowing his days were growing shorter, yet she refused to let sorrow overshadow the love he still gave. She promised herself that just as he had stayed with her through the hardest nights, she would stay with him until the very end. The day came quietly on a golden morning when sunlight spilled through the curtains. Shadow lay with his head in her lap, his breathing shallow but peaceful. The girl stroked him gently, tears sliding silently down her cheek. She told him stories of their first meeting, of the nights he kept her warm, of the moments he had saved her when she thought she couldn't go on. And then, with one last sigh, Shadow slipped away, leaving behind not emptiness, but a legacy of love. She buried her face in his fur, whispering through her grief, "You saved me, and I'll carry you with me forever." Grief lingered, heavy and consuming, but it was also filled with gratitude. The girl realized that while Shadow's body was gone, his spirit lived on in every choice she made, every act of kindness she shared, and every animal she saved in her new path as a veterinarian. His paw prints were etched permanently on her soul. She carried his collar on her desk, not as a symbol of loss, but as a reminder of the bond that had reshaped her life. Whenever she faced hardship, she touched it and felt the same courage Shadow had once given her. Years later, standing at the opening of her very own animal shelter, the girl smiled as children ran through the halls, playing with rescued dogs and cats. She had named the shelter Shadow's Haven, in honor of the companion who had once been her haven in a world that had forgotten her. Reporters asked her for her story, and she shared it with quiet pride, not to glorify herself, but to show others that even in the darkest moments, love could change everything. And as she spoke, she swore she could almost feel Shadow's presence beside her, his tail wagging in approval. Her life, once marked by abandonment and loneliness, had become a tapestry of hope and healing, all because of a bond with a German shepherd who had chosen her when no one else did. Their story lived on in every animal saved, in every child who found comfort, in every broken heart mended by compassion. And though Shadow was gone, he was never truly up. For in every corner of her life, his love still echoed, melting hearts just as it had melted hers on that fateful winter night.